Okay, our next speaker is Gene Preston. When I was about a year and a half into my climate solutions adventure, a chemical engineering colleague told me about this guy who lives in Austin, Texas, that I should meet. I have a son who lives in Austin, so the next time we made a trip to see our son Dave, his wife, and our two grandkids, I met Gene at a Tex-Mex restaurant for breakfast. At that time, I began learning that our ERCOT grid might be a little wobbly. Gene's expertise is in high voltage transmission, grid distribution, and grid reliability. I look forward to your remarks, Gene. Take it away.
Thank you, Tom. You know, if it wasn't for Tom, is my audio okay?
Yep.
I put this headset on because my camera speaker sounds muffled, and this microphone is a little higher pitched and it gives better clarity.
You sound just fine.
Yeah, I want to thank Tom for inviting me to this. It really makes you sit down and work toward putting together a decent presentation. And, you know, I have all these ideas, but nobody knows about them except me, unless I sit down and actually put something together. So this is the second time I've done this for Tom. And in my last presentation, I was saying that I was going to talk about renewables, but the grid's getting less reliable. And back then I had predicted that by 2027, we could have 54 emergency events per year. Little did I know that it was only a few months away from Storm Uri. And I'm going to talk about how deficient we were in generation during that storm. It's a huge problem for us. Before I do that, though, I want to tell you a story about the difficulty of selling nuclear power. Tom and I are nuclear proponents. So a ham radio friend in Dallas named Bill said, Gene, I'd like for you to join the North Texas Renewables Group. I did. And we had some conversations about renewables. And so one time we were talking about Puerto Rico, and I said, you know, Puerto Rico isn't really going to survive on just wind power and solar because of the hurricanes. And I said, they're going to have to have some nuclear power. And at that point, the renewables group said, Gene, we cannot tolerate that idea in our group. You are therefore evicted from our group. So much for giving them advice. But Bill is still my friend. In fact, Bill is the fellow that he and I are talking about the gravity stuff. Let me see if I can put my presentation up here. Let's see, is this it? Okay, can you see it?
Looks good.
Okay, good. Now I've got this thing formatted so that I can just change pages easily. So I changed the title a little bit to ERCOT's continuing decline in reliability, but I kept the statement, ERCOT's reliability has declined to dangerously low levels and is continuing to decline due to, and here's the key, unusual interaction of the transmission constraints with NERC reliability rules and ERCOT's financing of new lines. This is a really odd situation we're in, which I only came to realize this past year in doing solar studies for clients. It became more and more apparent to me that for each new solar site, and I was looking at solar sites all over Texas, we were having a lot more transmission constraints in those studies. And so what I did is I ran a special harmers helpers analysis. And in this analysis, I was able to tell the solar client that your solar plant is going to dispatch ahead of that gas plant over there. It might be 100 miles away. You're going to be able, when you come online, he's going to have to back down a few megawatts. Now, because he impacts that overloaded line, he doesn't have to back down very much, but you can operate at full output because you're going to make him decrease. And so, and I charge a little bit of extra money for that extra analysis. So lately, every study I'm doing on solar power, and there's literally solar plants all over the place here and out West Texas, not so many in the Panhandle. Now, we have these generic transmission constraints, which is the maximum power flow, from the Panhandle. We have about 4 gigawatts of power. By the way, ERCOT's peak demand's in the 77 gigawatt range, and maybe 40 gigawatts during mild weather. But we have this limit here, which limits the amount of wind we can put in the Panhandle to about 4 gigawatts. There's about 10 gigawatts of potential up here. These farmers, they want to put in wind. They're waiting hands out. What keeps you guys so long? Why aren't you up here? Well, it's this constraint. We only had enough money to build this set of CREZ lines here, which got us up to a level where we could export the 4 gigawatts. Recently, there's a new 11 gigawatt transfer maximum. Now, there's a lot of wind and solar out here. This is really ideal country for solar. It's not very cloudy. There's a lot of just almost useless land out here. If you look at it, I mean, I look at these solar sites on satellite view, wow, that's a perfect site for solar power because there's nothing else growing there. But because they have this constraint here, the economics aren't working out very well. So these constraints here are putting a cap on the maximum amount of solar and wind that can be put out here. Now, ERCOT just posted an update. If you go back and look at this file here, here's the presentation, so you can access the presentation. And if you look at this right here, you'll see some rather detailed studies that ERCOT's doing right now. So what's happening here is we're adding a lot of solar. We're going to have 15 gigawatts of solar in 2022. I think the whole basis of this talk is that these solar plants are going to drive a lot of these gas plants off the grid. And a lot of these gas plants are inside metropolitan areas. Austin's already retiring Decker 1 and Decker 2, about 750 megawatts, which makes a problem for us because now we run the risk of having a blackout inside Austin. San Antonio's closing plants. Houston's been retiring plants for some time. The reason I want you to become familiar with this problem is because these bullet items might not make sense unless I showed you that transmission map. Okay, now we know from Storm Uri that the gas system is not really reliable in cold weather. These references here are from Southwest Power Pool, mostly Southwest Power Pool testimony, talking about difficulties they had in getting gas. They do not believe that weatherization was the major problem. There just flat isn't enough, there's not enough gas infrastructure built to supply all the gas flow to everyone all at the same time for an extended 100 days of cold weather. And Storm Uri was really an extended cold event. So when ERCOT does its studies, when ERCOT is doing these studies for more transmission lines out here, what ERCOT does is they put in their studies gas plants here because they say putting in gas plants here is cheaper than building these transmission lines and relying on renewables. Well, that's true, except that the gas plants aren't being able to build new plants. So the gas plants have this solar to contend with. They also have future climate change considerations discouraging that. ERCOT has the authority to uplift new transmission costs for conventional generation-based plants like gas plants. If they get built, if the gas plant builds, then ERCOT then can show there's a reliability problem. They can build lines inside the state. NERC requires that certain outage tests be performed, transmission lines outage be performed, and if the grid is unreliable based on these tests, then ERCOT has justification to build new transmission lines. But ERCOT does not have the authority to build lines for variable power resources from renewables. So ERCOT might see an overloaded line due to renewables, but they can't do anything about it. So renewables are taking away all of the available transmission for the coal and gas plants. Combining items 1 through 4 implies that the fossil fuel capacity will continue to decline, possibly, I think, at an increasing rate after 2022, because we have this huge growth in solar in 2022. The capacity decline in fossil fuels is causing an increase in emergency events. The price spikes from the emergency events might be a basis for investing in more fossil fuel plants to reduce the yearly number of emergency events. However, the constraints imposed by 1, 2, and 4 are roadblocks to the building of these new fossil plants. See, the ERCOT hasn't factored this item into their studies because the people that are doing the economic analysis in ERCOT don't do the transmission studies for solar plants. So they don't realize that the solar plants are going to outbid the gas plants. Back when I was working with NERC, I was working with a person in the NERC office about 2017, and I said, you know, we could build a solar plant right beside a brand new gas plant in South Texas and drive them completely off. But the solar plant doesn't have to do that. All they have to do is threaten the gas plant, pay us some money, and we won't build a solar plant. And the person just laughed and says, the academics have no idea what's going on in the real world, do they? So there's also a recent rise in the genetic transmission constraints, which limits new generation, particularly out west, but there are GTCs all over the grid. Now I want to talk about Storm Uri's. The way NERC and ERCOT put the data together, it makes it look like ERCOT and Southwest Power Pool fared fairly well in Storm Uri. But ERCOT and Southwest Power Pool, the way they showed their data makes ERCOT look better than it really was. So what I did is I took a NERC report and I took the firm generation, coal in both regions, natural gas in both regions, nuclear in both regions, other sources. And then the Southwest Power Pool had 6,000 megawatts of tie lines, but ERCOT was not able to bring any power of significance from the Southwest Power Pool region over its tie lines. It had 800 megawatts because Southwest Power Pool needed all the power. They didn't have anything to give us. So if you add, and if you have half the gas outage in both regions, you add all these up, ERCOT had 53,000 megawatts, SPP had 54,000 megawatts, but our projected peak demand was this number here, and this is the projected peak demand of Southwest Power Pool. And if you look at what's left over and you compare it to Southwest Power Pool, we're 30,000 megawatts more deficient than Southwest Power Pool was. So because we were more deficient, we had to start load shedding a lot sooner. Okay, what about the weather? This is what I was going to talk to. This is what I told Tom I was going to talk about on the weather. Am I still online? Is my audio still there?
Yep, you're good.
Oh, good.
Yes, Gene, we can hear you. Everything's going good.
I bumped my cord here, and I thought maybe I got disconnected.
No,
So what we had from a planning standpoint of the grid, we're having more extreme temperatures. From back when I was doing planning for Austin, we would plan for 102 degrees max in the summer and 20 degrees min temperature in the winter. But I think today we probably need to plan for 115 degrees in the summer peak temperature. It's called a heat dome, and it can persist for a period of time over a region because the highs and the lows they're powering up. They have more power, and it makes the jet stream zigzag, and it stays in one spot longer. And I think this is one reason why we had a more longer cold spell with Uri than normal, because these highs and lows tend to hang around a little bit longer. Now we probably should plan for 115 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit in the winter. This is harder to plan the system for that temperature range. Long range planning. Okay, in the time period 1970 to 1995, before deregulation, we did forward planning on the system. And when we had a cold spell in 1973, we had natural gas was deficient, and at that time we realized we needed to we had oil tanks. We didn't have oil tanks. We had oil tanking cars coming in continuously for about a month. And we also realized that we needed to build coal and nuclear plants to not be so dependent on natural gas. So the deregulation laws in the 1990s removed the ability of Texas to perform long-range generation planning because these alternative sources of power are more expensive than natural gas plants. But then when you do reliability studies and you do long-range planning, you realize that you need some sources of power that might be a little more expensive than natural gas. We did not know at the time that climate change would have on the power system when deregulation laws were passed and the current energy market was set up. We did not know that we were headed into a future with problems. Now, how well is ERCOT doing? In the early years of deregulation, 2000 to 2011, there was a large number of combined cycle high efficiency gas plants installed. This is before the older gas plants that had oil backup were retired. And we had a lot of excess generation. So by the time of 2011, we really had quite a bit of excess generation. So we didn't have nearly the load shedding. And also 2011 storm was not as long. It was 100 hours shorter than Uri. Now, how well was NERC and ERCOT working together to winterize their power plants? Well, this graph in the NERC report indicates that ERCOT thought they were doing quite well on winterization because they were having fewer problems with instrumentation. That's before Storm Uri. In the years 2011 to 2021, the combination of low gas prices and growth in wind resources in ERCOT was having a negative impact on coal plants and older gas plants. And we saw quite a number of plants being retired, coal and gas plants being retired, particularly in the Houston area. These retirements of gas plants and coal plants in the Houston area created a power import problem for Houston. In other words, they were too dependent on those internal plants. So in all of ERCOT, about 6 gigawatts of coal plants were retired in the 2018 timeframe that had not been predicted by Potomac economics. I'm gonna have to turn on some equipment here. I've got my solar panels running, and that alarm back there says that I need to turn on my car for charging, but I'm gonna turn on the pool equipment. Okay. 1.4 kilowatts. I need some load. Okay, so ERCOT was showing signs of capacity deficiency in starting with 2018, and I reported this to the IEEE Resource Adequacy Working Group in August of 2020. I made a similar presentation to ECH with an opening remark about a need to focus on just keeping the lights on. And I had reported that 54 days of shortfall in 2027. Now, the latest Potomac economics report says that nuclear plants may be operating at a loss in 2020. Well, this is a red flag warning, which is pretty much ignored by everyone in ERCOT. What happened here is that the clearing price on the average clearing price for the nodal energy several years earlier was about $40 per megawatt hour. It's dropped down to about $25 per megawatt hour. And that's a kind of a crossover point where the nuclear needs that kind of revenue just selling its energy if it's going to stay in business, just to pay for O&M costs. So recently I added this helpers harmers analysis, and I'm showing that I'm showing the solar plants how they can knock gas plants off the grid. So I'm part of the problem, I guess. Now, Austin's freezing weather began on February the 11th and continued through February the 20th. Uri ran for 100 hours longer than the 2011 storm. And the coldest parts of Uri appeared in the last 100 hours. I think if the temperature had not dropped so low and the storm had ended 100 hours earlier, there's a good chance that the load shedding would have been minimal in ERCOT. This is what ERCOT expected and had planned for. ERCOT did appeal for load reduction. These are all links if you look at my paper. So the climate change was probably responsible for the extra duration in time, and also the jet stream dragging the cold air south and remaining in place longer. Now here's an interesting snapshot I took of the ERCOT app right before. I didn't realize it was right before the blackout, and this is what it looked like on my phone. You can see the power and the loads going down. They're already well into forced curtailment here, but you can see right here the ERCOT was expecting about 74 gigawatts. But they amended that later to say 77 gigawatts. They probably would have had Okay, so I set up this model to show what Uri looks like. Now I didn't have the 2021 data, so I took 2019 data and I modified it so that I added the kind of condition in the 2019 timeframe that we looked at during Storm Uri. This right here has about 50% of the gas capacity outaged. Also, about 50% of the wind capacity was outaged. You can see that the solar, this is the amount of solar power went through the period. This is the wind that was supplied. So right here, you kind of get an idea of the gap between the load level, what we think it would have been, and the capacity actually available. Now, if you add the 2022 wind and solar to that previous case, and there's a lot of wind and solar in 2022 coming online, you see this, it closes the gap a little bit. And then if you reduce the gas outages, gas plant outages from 50% to 10%, a lot of utilities in these storm events do have an additional amount of gas capacity outage. You see that we're still a bit short here, but we almost make it. Now this assumes that all of our plants, like nuclear plants and everything, runs and stays online, that we don't have any forced outages, which is really optimistic. If you did the probability studies correctly, you would find that the expected loss of load here might be a little higher. What have we learned? Well, the expectation that gas alone will provide reliability fails. The people who like the current situation in ERCOT, they like wind, solar, and natural gas because they want to use gas to support the reliability. However, it fails just simply because when everybody draws on the gas system at the same time, there's probably not enough gas. Now, the other day we got down to about 26 degrees here in Austin, and the gas supply system was already starting to fail there, and it was hardly even freezing. So that was a sign that the gas supply system in Texas isn't adequate for actually doing this job of serving our load reliably. I asked Kirsten in our Maryland group if Texas was involved in a lot of new gas well drilling. She says, well, it appears to be, but she couldn't tell which wells were going to be successful. Anyway, 47 years ago, we had the same problem. The expectation that wind, solar, and gas will provide a reliable source of energy fails. The Southwest Power Pool problems with wind and gas supplies are nearly identical with ERCOT's experience. Some of those SPP testimonies are fascinating to listen to. Low reserve margins in ERCOT led to rolling outages, or worse, which could be a blackout, in extremely cold weather. We can expect another Storm Uri, if we had another Storm Uri, to probably result in the same problems that we had. Maybe ERCOT will be a little bit better prepared this time to deal with it, better communications and better load shedding. By better load shedding, the providers, companies are looking at using individual meters, cutting off customers using their individual meters. The reason why they're not doing this is because the data transmission is not there. There are too many customers, too many meters to control, and it takes too long to roll through all of these customers. And so they don't really have that working yet. They're still at the feeder level. Load shedding beyond contracted interruptible load constitutes a failure to meet the NERC requirements. The only load that we're supposed to be shedding here is load where we have an agreement with that customer that, yeah, it's okay, we can shed your load. Certainly not Samsung's load. And the electronics companies in Austin suffered heavily. So I wanted you to know that the 1 day in 10 years, which is a NERC standard, it doesn't mean that that the whole day is outaged once every 10 years. It means that during a day, there are a few hours of shortage of capacity, and it's only supposed to happen about once every 10 years. So only a few hours, maybe 4 hours for that day. The solution is the same now as it was 47 years ago. Diversify your generation to reduce dependency on unreliable sources, which means that we probably need to add some nuclear power. What are the solutions? Well, 100%, I've modeled some of these solutions in spreadsheets, and I think this is a link to that. Purely 100% wind and solar plan and batteries, you can do it in ERCOT with 80 gigawatts to 100 gigawatts of wind and solar each. Now, it turns out that in ERCOT, because the solar fills in the daytime and the wind fills in not during the middle of the day, but other hours best, the optimum mix of solar and wind in ERCOT is about equal amounts of capacity. So we're going to have, at the end of 2022, we're supposed to have about 36 gigawatts of wind and about 20 gigawatts of solar. The problem with these 100% plans is the transmission requirements are too large. We can't build enough power lines here to get nearly this amount of capacity of wind and solar. So I put an X on that. Also, the capital cost of the battery would be over $1 trillion. A plan that is more balanced is one where you could have 40 gigawatts of wind, 40 gigawatts of solar, and 40 gigawatts of nuclear. This means that the nuclear is going to be covering the base load rather well. But the transmission requirements can be more easily met if we put these nuclear plants around, possibly at locations where there were large coal plants, sort of converted the system over. So this plan is, it looks more attractive than the 100% wind. So we still have problems in the plan, but they're much easier to solve. We have a reliable source of energy. So the new nuclear plants would be designed for safety. We need NRC approval as soon as possible if we're going to get new nuclear plant designs in soon enough so that we can effectively deal with climate change and grid reliability. ERCOT need new rules that allow and promote the building of new nuclear plant designs. We're talking about rules that favor the funding of high capital cost projects. I'm not talking about a carbon fee or anything like that. I'm talking about accountability rules on capacity and loss of load probability and energy security, you know, it needs to be direct. I don't even like the Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland plan of a capacity market, because the capacity market up there has been favoring gas plants of all things, because the nuclear plants come in a little bit expensive. Now, there is a possibility that we could produce a gas, hydrogen, from clean power and pump it via pipelines to load centers. This past week, we had a seminar at the University of Texas in Canada on the hydrogen creation and shipping and storage. I was quite impressed by the presentation. So that got me to thinking, if we wanted to move large amounts of energy across the US, which is better, pipelines, maybe hydrogen, maybe some other gas, or this electric grid? Now, the Green New Deal has this little stick figure diagram here of DC lines. First place, you can't construct a network of DC lines between nodes like this, because every DC line has to have its power dialed in. That means you got to have a centralized computer running this entire grid. Guess what happens if the centralized computer stops working? Whole grid goes down. It's unreliable. Not only that, you're not going to tie all of Texas' needs into Houston. Houston has terrible transmission lines internally. They need about 5 or 6 nodes down here, and the ties. I mean, look, we'd need what, 20 gigawatts. What are we going to do? Put 20 gigawatts in one little line here? Well, he does have other lines, but this is not a valid transmission plan. This plan was put together by some people who basically don't know what they're doing. Now, this plan over here makes sense because you can pretty well run these gas pipelines anywhere you want to. They're just showing that you could use them for transportation. A less attractive option is to build new gas plants using carbon capture and sequestration. And the University of Texas Bureau of Economic Geology is ideally suited to do this. And they also need to they need to write up reports that are rather formal on locations where we can actually build CCS, because Austin needs some generation inside the city. Houston needs more generation inside the city. Maybe you could use maybe you could pump the gas into the ground in Houston. I don't know. one of the problems is that there's some concern if you pump too much of this gas into the ground, it can cause earthquakes. And I know that that's going to be a problem for Austin, trying to build a gas power plant with carbon capture and sequestration. The citizens aren't going to stand for it. I was telling my university friends that they've got a really steep hill to climb on convincing people that the CCS is the way to go. So geothermal is a possibility. However, the best sites are in the western US. You might have some down there on the coast. Hydro resources are not really applicable to Texas because there's not sufficient rainfall. More wind generators on the Texas coast have a host of environmental problems, as well as the possibility of damage from hurricanes. A lot of people are opposed to, the Navy and cities, and there's some landowners that don't like these wind generators. I've been hired to do studies about their property because they were worried there would be wind generators near their property. And I assured them that after looking at it, that there's too many transmission line limitations for more wind generators to be built down there in South Texas. Pretty much the wind down around Brownsville has saturated the transmission lines. By the way, the wind generation down there drove off the gas plant Frontera. They switched over to Mexico, probably for the reasons that I stated. The nodal prices were too low. About 20 miles offshore, the winds are too low and the costs are too high to make offshore wind feasible for ERCOT. And the current wind solar battery expansion plans relying on an unreliable gas supply and aging gas plants with little oil burning capability is a recipe for frequent power outages. We need to work together to fix this reliability problem, and we need to do this as soon as possible. Now, I did want to say, I don't have much in here, but I did want to mention that we think that maybe small modular nuclear reactors might be suitable at military bases, and then there are floating nuclear power plants. Thorcon is trying to work with some of the islands in the Pacific. They build a nuclear plant in Sweden, 500 megawatts. They float it to the site. They dig out a place where they bring this whole plant in and lower it down and anchor it in place. It's 500 megawatts. This would be ideal for Puerto Rico. It could be used in the Houston area. I think what we could do is we could use that technology, eliminate the petrochemical company from having to worry about developing their own nuclear plant, and just run a 138 kV transmission line over there and tap into this power plant rather easily. You could have a deal where you could as a private utility, a private user network, you could have your own nuclear power plant right there on the coast. And I think that the hydrogen economy is a good idea too. Rather than the transmission lines, let's build a set of pipelines that shares energy across the U.S. So am I over with my time, Tom?
Well, we got 4 minutes before our break.
Okay. Are there any questions?
You didn't say anything about the big risk of if we lost the grid completely.
Yeah.
How many weeks we would be out of power?
They don't know. In simulations, ERCOT's been running simulations. They have a hard time getting everything back online, and I don't know how long it's going to take, but it could take a couple of weeks.
Yeah, so we were 4 minutes and 37 seconds away from that situation back in February, and we could have been out of power for at least 2 weeks, maybe. Which is
Matt Grady gave a talk about the possibility of electromagnetic pulse taking out power plants, and he said it was a possibility, but he said not to worry because ERCOT could probably get back online in a week, but he didn't know about our problems of getting the grid back going again. So that was too optimistic, probably. Question?
It seems like one of the problems is that ERCOT is a market-based approach that goes with the lowest cost provider.
That's definitely a problem.
So how are you going to get rid of ERCOT?
I'm not going to get rid of ERCOT. Can the petrochemical companies build reliability into their own power supplies? So if ERCOT goes down, you guys can keep operating. I
Well,
mean,
you
I'm
know-
talking to all my friends. I'm talking to all my friends. I said, you better get ready for a blackout because it's going to happen. And work with Tesla owners and all. We're working on that. Solar panels, batteries, you know, I don't know.
Well, I'm trying to get industry to start thinking about that, how they can become independent from the grid. So we're not making a lot of progress so far, but people are starting to talk about it.
Think about it. What if we have another Uri event? Don't you think? I mean, everything the governor has said is going to just go down the tube. His credibility would be completely shot.
I think Claudia has her hand up.
And
Yes,
Patricia.
I do. I attended a potential for hydrogen talk on Thursday. When we got through, everything was so short range. And I'm going, come on, guys. I saw my first e-car charging station this week. Think you're going to get the hydrogen charging stations across the country in a matter of years?
Let me say something about that. The new Green Deal transmission plan doesn't get completed until 2050. So you're
I'm
looking.
not sure
I mean,
that's even viable.
well, I don't think it is either. But they put it so far into the future that let's not worry about it right now. I see Matt Weldon's
I
here.
was stunned when I pulled into the Sam's filling station that over on the side were the charging stations, and I had never seen any before. Of course, it's just off of I-40. Logical place to put one, but still.
You know, for 18-wheelers, the electric energy charging needs are rather high. I don't think there's a problem for cars, but Elon's putting his truck construction back. He's moving those things back. There are problems with those things, and charging stations for 18-wheelers is a problem.